Thank you for joining in my talk. I am Kumar Maity. I am a grad student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. This is a joint work with Professor Cameron Muskell. In this work, I'm going to talk about estimation of shortest path covariance matrices. Covariance matrix estimation is actually a classical problem. In this problem, we have an underlying distribution D, and we have n different independent samples, x1 to xn in D-dimensional, and all these data samples are actually mean zero, and the covariance is actually sigma. The goal of the problem is to output a matrix sigma tilde, which is actually epsilon away from each other in spectral norm. One of the metric of this algorithms is to calculate the sample complexity, which is actually the number of data samples the algorithm need access to achieve epsilon error. It is a folklore, and it is very well known in the case of sub-Gaussian distribution. In sub-Gaussian distribution, given n data points, if you take the outer product of each data vector and take an average of it, and which is a very good estimate, and which is actually epsilon away from the actual covariance matrix in the spectral norm, and the number of samples needed for this estimation is actually theta d over epsilon square. Recent work has been done to leverage the structure of the covariance matrices to improve the sample complexity. Sometimes it has been assumed that the particular covariance matrix is actually sparse, or low rank, or sparse plus low rank, or banded matrix. Banded matrix means that the weight of the matrix, all the weight of the matrix is actually concentrated along the diagonal of the matrix, and the terms farther away from the diagonal of the matrix is actually faded away, or like it decreased exponentially. In this work, we're going to discuss about graph structure, and we're going to see how we can leverage graph structure to achieve better sample complexity in terms of vector and empty sample complexity, which I'm going to discuss in the following slides. Graph structure covariance matrices arise in different applications such as gene regulatory network, transportation network, social networks, and graph signal networks. In all of these networks, the data has an inherent underlying graph structure and graph structure. Now let's focus on the problem. We assume that there is an underlying graph, and we can take this graph that is been shown in the left side of the slide as an example, and each node of the graph corresponds to a coordinate of the random vector. So in this case, we assume that the problem is actually 9-dimensional. So there are 9 nodes in this graph, and each covariance term sigma ij depends on the shortest path distance between corresponding nodes I and j. So for each coordinate, there is a corresponding node in the graph, and the covariance between I and jth node is actually depends on the shortest path distance between them. So the covariance between, say, like node 1 and 3 is actually depends on the shortest path distance, that is, which is 2 away from each other. Also, all pairs with the same path distance have the same covariance. That means that the covariance between 1, 2 and 2, 3 are same as they are the same. They have the same path distance, which is actually 1. Now, some interesting matrix structures comes from the different underlying graph structure. If the graph is a cycle, then we get a circular type covariance matrices. If the graph is a chain, then we get a turbulence type matrices. And if graph is a grid, then we get a multidimensional turbulence matrices. Now, as I have said in the previous slide, that the covariance between any two coordinate depends on the shortest path distance of the corresponding nodes of the underlying graph. Now, and all pairs with the same path distance have the same covariances. So it is only required, we only require to estimate the covariance term corresponds to different shortest path distances, all possible shortest path distances. So here, interestingly, we can choose a path corresponding to the diameter of the graph, which is in this problem that in this graph, the diameter is 6. So we can choose the path which is shown in this by these red lines. And we can choose the path according to this red line. And this is the path corresponding to the diameter of the graph. So this path actually have all possible shortest path distances. In general, if d is the diameter of the graph, then we have to estimate d plus 1 different covariance terms according to d plus 1 possible shortest path distances. And so generally we have to estimate a vector, a d plus 1 dimensional vector. And by this vector, we can actually fill out all the ij term in the covariance matrices. Interestingly, if we notice the fact that for the estimation of the covariance, all the covariance term or all the d plus 1 different covariance terms, we do not need access to all the entries of the samples. We just need the entries of the samples corresponding to this path. So now, by this technique called sparse ruler, we do not need all the entries in the path too. We can have a fraction of the node which will be sufficient to represent all possible shortest path distance. And here in this graph, we showed which particular node to choose to represent all possible shortest path distances. If we want to have like distance 1, which is 1 between 1 and 2, if we want to have shortest path distance 2, which is 6 and 8, and so on, like distance 3 can be found between 2 and 6, and so on. So it is it is very interesting to find out that by choosing only 4 nodes or the 4 coordinates of each samples, we are being able to estimate the shortest path covariance matrix. This is a very simple like a proper definition of what a sparse ruler look like. A sparse ruler is actually a subset of points which can be used to represent all possible distance between this set of distance between the pairs of points in that set. And it is well known how to construct. There is a very simple construction where you choose only deterministically, you choose only square root of d points from that to represent all possible pairwise distance of in the set d, in the set consisting of d elements. Now, by this idea, there are 2 different metrics of sample complexity comes. One is vector sample complexity, which has been used in a very classical sense, which is the number of independent samples you require to estimate this particular covariance matrices. And second is entry sample complexity, that is the number of entries in each samples you need or the algorithm must read to estimate the covariance matrices. And in this work, we apply sparse ruler on the path corresponding to the diameter of the graph to get a much lesser entry sample complexity, which is much less than the dimension of the sample. Here is in this slide, I'm going to explain our method. First, we have an underlying graph. Then we choose the path corresponding to the diameter of the graph. We apply sparse ruler on that graph. Now we're going to read for each data sample, we're going to read entries corresponding to this corresponding to the entry that I have marked with purple. Now the goal is to estimate all possible covariance according to the all possible shortest path distances. So for each shortest path distance S, what you do is you take the product of xi for each sample L, you take the product of xi times xj, where ij is actually S distance away in the corresponding graph, and you take a sample average of that, and which is a particularly good unbiased estimate of the term As. And after this A tilde S is estimated and given the graph G, you can actually construct a sigma tilde. Later, by this algorithm, we prove a sample complexity upper bound. So if for any given epsilon delta greater than 0, the algorithm actually returns a sigma tilde, which with high probability, with probability 1 minus delta, gives achieves a epsilon error in spectral norm with entry sample complexity theta square root d, where capital D is the diameter of the underlying graph, and vector sample complexity r square log d by delta by epsilon square, where r is the rank of the corresponding covariance matrices. So it is very interesting to find out that the sample complexity bound is dependent on the rank of the matrix, but not the dimension of the matrix. And we have found that for many graphs, the inter-sample complexity is actually very small or mostly sublinear in D. But for a full rank case, this is actually d square by epsilon square times log d over delta. And it is, if we compare it with the classical approach, which is d over epsilon square, we'll lose by a factor of capital D. And the bound is very loose because in the proof, we actually do not find the bound in terms of sample spectral norm, but in terms of Frobenius norm, and then we give a very loose, which is a very loose bound on the spectral norm. And further studies are needed to make this bound much tighter. We also provide a lower bound for the sample complexity. Here, for the lower bound, we assume that the underlying graph has inter-sample complexity to be S, which is order of square root D. And we prove that you need at least d square by a square epsilon square data points to achieve a epsilon error in spectral norm of the covariance matrices. It is evident from these two theorem that the upper and lower bound differs by a factor of d, which is the diameter of the underlying graph. In this difference is actually minor in case of graphs with small diameter, which is obvious, and major. The gap is actually major in when the diameter is actually large, in case of a path graph, which leads to stable structure. But I should mention here that for particular cases, or for the Toeplitz matrix, covariance matrix with Toeplitz structure, the algorithm analysis has been done where they achieve matching upper and lower bound, and in this case some kind of Fourier based analysis is required. Now I have talked about shortest path distance based covariance matrix estimation, and in different applications this kind of shortest path based estimation is being done, as in ecological studies and geographically determined graph study for genetic variance among separated populations, or something called Kriging method, or like Gaussian process regression, where they have found that instead of using shortest path based metric, shortest path based metric is actually much better representation than the Euclidean based distance metric. In conclusion, here we study and analyze the shortest path covariance estimation, where we show an algorithm on how to estimate covariance estimation based on an underlying graph. We provide upper and lower bound, and we must say that there further studies are needed to close the gap between the upper and lower sample complexity bound, and we are actually currently in the process of making some progress in closing the graph for some restricted class of tree, which is not easy to do, but a simple generalization for any tree, generalized tree, would be very interesting. And there are several questions are also needed to be answered, and we find it very interesting. One of them is that, can low inter-sample complexity be achieved for other graph structure, such as Gaussian Markov random field? Like, can we apply the idea of low inter-sample complexity for different kind of other graph structure or graph signal processing problem? Also, another problem is that, can one characterize the class of covariance matrices for which you have like access to a sublinear number of entries per samples? And I would these are the problems we are like to explore and answer in the future. Thank you for joining in this talk.